although the author did not record his name within the text itself. A common practice in the ancient world, the first book found in the New Testament has historically been attributed to the writing of Matthew, a tax collector and one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Although some New Testament scholars doubt the authorship of Matthew, there are good reasons to believe that he was, indeed, the author of the first Gospel. There are at least 2 lines of external evidence that can be rallied to the defense of Matthew: 1, the superscription of the ancient manuscripts, and 2, the patristic witness. A superscription is text added to an ancient manuscript by a scribe for purposes of identification. It acts as a title. According to New Testament scholar D. Edmund Hebert, the first Gospel's identifying superscription, the Gospel according to Matthew, is the oldest known witness concerning its authorship. Scholars believe the superscription was added as early as AD 125, and the superscription is found on all known manuscripts of this Gospel. This fact is a powerful testimony to the uniformity of evidence with regard to the authorship of Matthew. The second line of evidence is the patristic witness. The early church fathers were unanimous in crediting the Gospel to Matthew. Hebert claims, the earliest is the testimony of Papias, bishop of Hierapolis, dating to the first half of the 2nd century. Following Papias is Irenaeus, who wrote his famous Against Heresies around AD 185. The next church father to attribute authorship to Matthew is Origen, who wrote in the early 3rd century. He is quoted by Eusebius, who wrote in the early 4th century. Finally, Eusebius himself, in the early 4th century, documents that Matthew wrote the first Gospel. There is an unbroken witness to Matthew as the author of the first Gospel going back to at least the middle of the 2nd century, and there is no contradictory witness found in any of the church fathers. Due to the fragmentary nature of documentary evidence in the ancient world, our ability to trace back authorship to within 100 years of the original writing of the first Gospel is exceptional. Surely this presents a persuasive case for Matthew authorship. Internal evidence. The following are 7 pieces of internal evidence which suggest, first, that the author was a Jew, and second, that he was Matthew. Familiarity with the nation. The author was familiar with geography, Jewish customs, Jewish history. He calls Herod Antipas tetrarch instead of king. He displays a concern for the Old Testament law, and puts an emphasis on the evangelistic mission to the Jewish nation as well. The evidence is quite strong for authorship by a Jew. Hints of Semitisms in his language. There are relatively few Semitic traces in Matthew, though one might note the heavy use of Toved, as compared with Mark and Luke, perhaps harking back to the Hebrew Zah. Beyond this, there is the occasional ascendito, a mark of Aramaic influence, use of the indefinite plural, etc. Although Matthew's Greek is less Semitic than Mark's, it does betray traces of Semitisms at times even where none exists in the Markan parallel. If Matthew did write this Gospel, one might not expect many Semitisms, since Matthew was a tax collector, and would therefore have to be conversant in Greek as well as Hebrew Aramaic. But the fact of some Semitism suggests either that the writer was a Jew or that his sources were Semitic. Yet, some of these are so much a part of the fabric of his Gospel Toved, that it is more reasonable to suppose that the author was himself a Jew. His use of Scripture. Gundry has ably pointed out how the author used the Old Testament, especially in his formula quotations. Although there are many Old Testament citations, which correspond to the LXX rendering, his own introductory formulae, which are not found in either Mark or Luke, all seem to be free translations of the Hebrew. If so, then the author most probably is a Jew. Further, he shows great familiarity with contemporary Jewish exegesis, and how he uses the Scriptures. Attack on Pharisees. Matthew's Gospel attacks the Pharisees and other Jewish leaders more than Mark or Luke do, as seen in chapter 3:7, 16:6, 11, 12, chapter 23. Perhaps the reason for this was, in part, due to how hard these religious leaders were on the tax collectors. They associated them with sinners and Gentiles. Not much can be made of this, however. Frequent use of numbers. The author's frequent use of numbers would be natural for a tax collector. He divides things into three parts: the genealogy, the trilogies of miracles in chapters 8 to 9, 5 parts, 5 great sermons of Jesus, all with the same closing formula, as seen in chapters 7, 28, 11, 1, 13, 53, 19, 1, 26, 1. 6 corrections on the misuse of the law in chapter 5, 7 woes, parables chapter 13, etc. Again, not much can be made of this argument, else one would have to say that a tax collector wrote the Apocalypse. But at least it is consistent with who Matthew was. His mention of money. A more weighty argument is the author's frequent reference to money, more frequent than the other gospel writers. In fact, he uses unique monetary terms: drachma, stater, talent. He alone of the synoptists speaks of gold and silver. Matthew contains the only 2 parables on talents. And he uses tax collector type terminology. Debts where the Lucan parallel has sins, bankers, etc. Especially when one compares the synoptic parallels, Matthew's use of monetary terms seems significant. The most reasonable hypothesis for this is that the author was quite familiar with money,